let's begin with our first presentation. There's a few words I want to say about Amir Elkabir, who is an experienced program manager working in a global multicultural environment with nearly 20 years of experience in management, customer-facing roles, and system implementation. Currently, he is as Director of Engineering Operations at Our Crowd. Amir heads the program management, support, and operations of a unique crowdfunding platform, making the investment in early-stage startups accessible more than ever before. Previously, Amir served as head of program management in the entertainment business line at AT&T Israel, worked at the fintech industry earlier, and assumed a few manager roles in the semiconductors industry. And over the last 3 years, Amir and his team have been studying and applying key practices for managing global teams effectively, applying follow the sun method. So the presentation is called Our Safe Journey, Our Safe and Our Safe Journey to Follow the Sun. So let's welcome Amir, it's his first time in Lithuania, by the way. So it's really nice to have Amir here build stuff. So a round of applause, both virtual and actual. Good to see you guys here in the stage. So let's welcome Amir.
Okay. Fabulous. Good morning, Lithuania. What a beautiful flag you have. And what a beautiful country you all have. I'll just make sure this works, yeah? So this is, first of all, not only one of the first physical events I've been to, since COVID is passing by, but this beautiful event is also being recorded. It's also being broadcasted live as we speak right now with many other people all around the world in their comfort of their home office. So first of all, I want to thank you, everybody out there all across the world watching us and giving your time here right now. I'm thrilled, I'm excited to be here, and this is going to be a great event. And for those who know me, also know that I love stories, and I love history, and boy, do I love technology. But my real passion lies where all those three intersect. So I invite you now to lay back, enjoy the ride, because this is going to be our safe journey to follow the sun. Now, I'm willing to bet that if I show you this piece of historical furniture, for lack of better words these days, right? This is going to be very familiar to probably many of you. So if you'd happen to grow up in the 1980s, as I did, this historical electronic device right here, it was very familiar in people's homes back in the days. I remember I had it in my home. It was very common in my friends' homes. I remember coming out of school with my friends, we'd go out to one another, we'd play with these all day long. And I'm, of course, talking about the computers of International Business Machines Corporation, also known as IBM. Now, perhaps very few people know this, but IBM was the biggest software company in the world back in the days. Not just a big computers company, not just electronics components, but software. So bigger than Microsoft, bigger than Compaq, Sun Microsystems, all of those. But the world started to evolve, started to change. The years passed by. We reached the early 1990s. And the competitive landscape around the world with the software industry started to change. At the beginning, tens of new software companies started to rise up, following by hundreds of new companies. Very quickly, thousands of new companies started to come up, world changing rapidly, software industry changing rapidly. But IBM, with their size and global presence and magnitude of scale, and with the lack of proper vision and strategy, coming all the way from the top, from the CEO, John Akers at the time, that started to be their biggest disadvantage. And so the board of directors of IBM started to notice that. And they showed John Akers the door and the way out. And they went outside and scouted to recruit for a new head for IBM, which eventually came down to this man, Lou Gerstner, where on April of 1993 was parachuted to the CEO chair of IBM, and who was later known as probably the best CEO IBM had ever had. Now Lou, he came with a very coherent approach, a clear vision, clear strategy. And what Lou said was, well, we must have one site somewhere around the world that's right now finishing their working day, 5 p.m., 6 p.m., whatever it is, closing their office lights, ready to go home. But at the same time, exact same time, we must have another site, a different site, somewhere else around the world, where they're ready to start their working day, right? Turn on their office lights, 9 a.m. in the morning, fresh start, get ready to go. And if we could only handshake effectively between our different sites, Lou said, get the ball rolling on client support, on software manufacturing and software shipping, then we could probably take that disadvantage, turn that into an advantage, and the term follow the sun was born. So different methodologies and methods started to get built up at IBM for follow the sun. It was cascaded down into the company, and very quickly it was embraced throughout corporate America and other corporates all around the world. So I pause here for a moment and fast forward 30 years into the future, to our times today. Many things changed since then, in the last 30 years, and particularly, we have changed. The way we communicate, the way we consume entertainment, the way we consume data in general, right? We have internet now, we have social media, and the way we develop software. We want to be much more adaptive to changes and to client changes. We want to ship new versions of software into production faster than ever before, and we want to ship features much more frequently. But a question always remains since then. How could large corporates, large organizations with mega projects still keep their advantage, leverage their advantage of global presence and international footprint while practicing Agile at very large scales, all at the same time? And so with that, I'd like to share a little case study with you, a real case study, and this one's about people. And this starts roughly around 5 years ago when my team and I were asked to join a global effort for shaping the future of how Americans consume entertainment. A flagship project, one of the biggest projects the entertainment group in one of the largest corporates in America had ever kicked off. So we get the go-ahead, we get the budget approvals and the green light, and we start rolling. So we quickly grew to just over 1,200 people on the program, spread across 5 different global locations, working on 7 Agile release trains, all working with 70 teams, 70 Scrum and Kanban and Agile teams, working on 10 different time zone areas, shipping a new version into production every 2 weeks. So literally, at the end of each sprint, a new version would reach production with this mega program. Now, I'll let this soak up. I'll let you soak this all up for just a second, because this is a huge magnitude of scale. This is a huge program, a very global, very wide. Lots of people, lots of programmers on the program. And I'll just ask you one simple question. How do you think this all went for us? Right? So we onboard such a team, we start rolling. How do you think this went for us? So while you're thinking in your head and looking at the numbers, I'll just share my simple answer with you. It was a disaster, complete disaster. I mean, nothing went well. You can imagine that by the time our colleagues stepped into their office, 9 a.m. in the morning, Los Angeles time, West Coast US, having their first cup of coffee, our folks back home, where I'm based out of in Tel Aviv, for example, were already having dinner with their families, sipping on their first glass of wine. So it was impossible to conduct any mutual ceremonies this way or have mutual meetings this way. But that wasn't it. We had programmers and developers developing in the exact same code repositories, the exact same code lines, sometimes amending each other's code, sometimes erasing each other's code overnight. We had such examples, developers coming in the morning, somebody erased their code overnight, just not really noticing, lack of synchronization. Sometimes the other way around, we had people and programmers duplicating each other's work. Imagine the waste going on such a style of development. And it was really lack of communication, lack of proper synchronization. And the distance, that did not make it any easier on us. It wasn't just the physical distance, but it was the way our teams were reliant on overseas. So for example, we had CI/CD teams and DevOps teams ramped up in West Coast US. And if a team came in the morning in London or Toronto and all their environments were down just because somebody on the other side of the world decided it's a good timing to run a maintenance window on the environments, best they could do was open a ticket and hope that somebody 10 hours later would figure that ticket out and take care of it. But the whole working day was gone, right? But that wasn't it. I mean, there was really lack of communication. Think of the language barrier, think of the culture barrier. We didn't know anybody. We were like ramped up as totally different sub-organizations, not really able to keep up with all the corridor and hallway conversations. Now, those corridor conversations are extremely important, especially in agile-driven organizations. I mean, think of yourselves. I'm sure you all came here today not just to listen to myself talk or listen to the other speakers talk. You came to interact, right? You came to bump into each other next to the coffee machine outside. You came here to have some informal chit-chats and conversations. Those are extremely important in any organization, and we couldn't keep up with any of that. Where do you think all the most important decision-making or ad hoc decision-making take place? Well, from my experience, it's not in the boardroom. It's probably right here next to the water cooler, right? In the corridors. So we lacked all of that, and everything I've just described had a direct impact on the program, which is why it was a disaster. Velocity was poor, team's morale was low, and work-life balance became unbearable. I mean, we've spent nights after nights sitting at home in our living rooms, attending video calls, looking something like that. In the last year or year and a half, I'm sure you all know what I'm talking about, but that was people's life, 1,200 of them for a good few years. And so that didn't work very well. But hey, we're tech leads, right? When we are given the opportunity to change the world, we do not give up very quickly, neither did we. So we were determined to crack this nut open, make it work, and we were determined to turn that disadvantage into an advantage. And so, what we decided to do was, we're going to meet, we're going to do a mini workshop. All the leads around in the different sites, we're going to get together and we're going to identify those key areas, 5 key areas. And we said that if we tackle those, just those, we might have a chance to make this work. And I'd like to walk you through these key areas. The first is the ceremonies, right? We wanted people to meet and talk and collaborate effectively and keep their work-life balance sane. And number 2, we wanted to tackle the issues, the main issues the teams had. On one hand, allow them to work autonomously, right, and be self-operating. But while doing that, we wanted them to be in sync between one another and with the entire program. Number 3, some best practices for software development in a software shop whenever you have distributed and dispersed teams, especially when they're cross-border teams. All right. Some, I would say, smarter backlog management fashion when working with external teams. And I get to that, and I'll tell you exactly what I'm talking about in just a few minutes. And finally, communication. Right? So communication is not last because it's least important, but it is last because usually when I hear people talk or write, they have the mindset that if they get communication right, then they get the global program right. So I want to tell you that from my experience, as much as communication is key, it is merely enough to make the system work is just a subset of these 5 areas, and we'll talk about that. So number 1, ceremonies, and I'd like to share with you some tips and quick wins from firsthand, from the trenches, what we've applied that made it work for us. I'm sure, by the way, that if all of you are working today or working in the future in global teams, if you'll take some of those quick wins, try to apply them in whatever industry you're working in, that may give a lot of added value. So the first thing we did with the ceremonies, we've met a few program managers in one location, and we've defined what is the list of ceremonies, of meetings we want to conduct, not more, not less. And then we divided that into 2. Local ceremonies, like you see on the left, global on the right. So let's take an example. Team retrospectives, or daily stand-ups. We're going to run those locally in one area. Every team is going to run that in their own time zone, in their own language. But let's say system demos or end of sprint demos, okay? So we wanted several teams working on the same component or the same feature to actually meet at the end of the sprint and conduct that together. So we put that on the global, and we put a little icon of a video conferencing icon. Now, this is not a slide that I brought here for the conference. This is actually something that we used, okay, to spread out the communication around our teams. And for the PI planning, we've decided that we're actually going to physically meet once every quarter and conduct that physically. Now, 1,200 people cannot really meet physically in one location. There's many constraints around that, budget constraints, for example, and others. So we've defined that we're at least going to have one individual, one liaison from each team that is going to fly over, they're going to meet in one location, and liaison for the rest of the team that's staying back home to conduct that PI planning. Point is that we've defined that list. It is that level of details that we went into, meaning which tools to use for each ceremony, and we've published that out. All of the regions, we wanted them to follow that. A second thing that we did with the ceremonies, and what worked for us, is humanize the ceremonies. Now, what you see here is a screenshot, actually, of a 10-second length video. Now, this is in particularly a team of ours, and they've conducted the Fist to 5 ceremony at the end of PI planning. And this is just an example, right? The confidence voting ceremony. And instead of sending their RTE and the rest of the teams working with them a one-liner email saying done, or not sending anything at all, we videotaped them simply with our phones and sent that video because we wanted everybody to see the faces behind the ceremony and the people behind the team. Create that level of engagement between the different teams that are spread around the world. So I can tell you that, we're all in tech. Technology moves forward rapidly, by the way, but people stay people. And so the more we humanize the tools and the ceremonies, the better off we will be. A third key point that we have applied is all of the teams get represented. Now, over here you can see Jerry, and Jerry is an RTE of one of the 7 arts, and he's holding a big program board. And the teams co-located with Jerry in his location, they're represented on his program board physically. But what about the rest of the teams? So we've invented some simple template, a virtual planning board, and those teams would plan, send Jerry their virtual board, and he would then later on put that on his physical board. And it would sit outside in the corridor, everybody could look at it, and he would send the picture to all the teams showing the physical board, and all the teams get represented. Now, this is very important from a mindset perspective, right? There's no local teams, remote teams. There's no one side being a lead and the other sides just supportive. All of the teams get represented and nobody gets left out. So just to wrap this really quickly up, right? If you want to summarize this area. Number 1, the ceremonies, list them. We've divided them to local and global, and we went into the details of which tools we want to use. And next, humanize the ceremonies. So videotaping teams and sending them across and generating this level of engagement, that's just one example, right? So if you'll be very creative, you'll come up with many more. And all the teams get represented. nobody gets left out. A second area was the teams, if you remember, in the sense of allowing them to work autonomously and self-operate and have as minimal dependencies overseas as possible. So what we did for that is we've pinpointed specific SMEs that we want to onboard them to the teams, and if we'll do that, it can generate a lot of impact. So for example, we knew our environments and DevOps teams were abroad. We've onboarded DevOps engineers and environments engineers, so that now if a team gets their environment down or a CI/CD pipeline stuck, they have somebody supporting them in their own time zone, in their own language, and their workday is not wasted. The waste goes, by the way, in budget, right? That's the trade-off. But our management understood that and acknowledged that. And it's quite worthwhile to onboard local people, specifically those that you know will get the work flowing for your teams. Now, at the same time that we wanted our teams to work autonomously, we wanted them to stay in sync between one another and with the program. And for that, we've modeled something that we called sister teams. So let me explain just a few seconds about that. When you have an example like on the left, one team working on one feature, co-located somewhere, that's a no-brainer. That's easy. Okay, that's easy to operate. That's like a general team. But when we have a feature being built by several Scrum teams, 3 Scrum teams, 2 as in this example, and let's say those 3 or 2 Scrum teams are even spread across the world in different places, but they're all developing one feature. So we've defined a troika. Now, a troika is 3 roles of an architect, PO, and Scrum Master. And we've defined that there will be one local troika oversighting the entire feature, all of the Scrum teams. But then we're going to have remote troikas in other teams, and in other areas. And what that allowed us, it allowed us for the flexibility where we didn't need anymore for all of the people to attend all of the meetings all of the time. We just needed the troikas to be in sync. They met, they got in sync. They were on top of the priorities. And then all we needed was for the troikas, and we were pretty confident that the troikas will sit alongside with their teams during their working days in their language, time zone, comfort of their offices. And we knew the teams will stay in sync because the troikas are in sync. And so, as much as we wanted our teams to work autonomously, we wanted them to stay in sync without ruining their work-life balance or creating a huge overload. And this is how we did that. And the third thing we did was onboard project managers. Now, I'm very well aware of this long-lasting debate of project managers, yes or no, in agile organizations. Now, I'm sure if I'll ask around here, some of you will say, yeah, I mean, it's needed, some of you not. I've been a project manager, I've managed project managers, so I've been in all of that debate. Only from my experience, I've come to learn that when you meet 2 conditions, number 1, scale up, and number 2, go global, there is a need for project managers to kind of be accountable for 4 of these key areas that will give a lot of value with agile-driven organizations whom are huge, working in huge multi-site projects. Now, first area is like team synchronization, make sure the teams are synchronized, running their ceremonies on time, the tools are working and all of that. Number 2, serving as kind of outbound liaisons. Many times there's going to be third-party vendors to interact with, and there's going to be testing groups to interact with, and so on. Track delivery timelines, but also track the team's performance, like velocity and burn down and stuff like that, and help the Scrum Masters. And 4th area is kind of glue this whole thing together. Right? There's many times going to be long-distance calls, and you need to make sure it glues together. Also, at the end of the sprint, no matter how many teams you have working on one feature, you're going to deliver one software. The end user is going to want to see one look and feel to it. So kind of glue all of that together. So if I want to wrap this up a little bit, those key learnings in the section of teams, right? When we tackle teams, what's the key takeaways that we took away with us? And number one is allow our teams to work autonomously as much as possible. And if we identify areas where they're dependent on overseas, then we fix that. Now, at the same time, they need to have a mechanism to allow them to be in sync with the program goals. And for that, we have modeled sister teams. Okay, we've onboarded troikas and we let them be in sync with one another. That's one example that really, really worked well for us at AT&T. But you know, as long as you keep that mindset. And finally, onboard project managers. Like, if you see that you're starting to scale up with more than, I don't know, a handful of teams per product, and when you're starting to go global, that can give a lot of value. Moving on to some best practices. Okay, we had to apply some best practices for engineers and programmers to work effectively, even though they're not co-located. So, first thing we did is we defined that they're going to have some code reviews between developers, but not just any two developers between different sites. Now, any two developers in order to allow us to scale, because if you only allow team leads or senior architects to conduct code reviews every time a developer checks in their code into GitHub or wherever, then you have bottlenecks. So any two developers. But because we've defined that also because we wanted our developers to do that between different sites, not only did our developers not erase each other's code anymore, but they approved each other's code. And that really bonded them and allowed them to work together. It actually forced them to work together. A second thing is we've applied community of practices. Now, a community is a group of people that will have the same interest like we all do right now. But we've defined that according to the components. So let's say iOS developers, they were a community, or web developers, and backend developers were a community, right? So we've established those communities of practices, and now each developer is not just part of a Scrum team, and they're not just part of a region, but they also feel part of a community. And being part of a community means being part of a global community, right? So they met on a weekly basis to share knowledge and information. And establishing communities is not driven by management dictation. Okay? It's not a management decision. What you want to do if you want to establish communities, some call it guilds, is you want to identify your champions at the beginning, but then it will run instantly, week over week. And it's really very important for the different developers in the same community to interact with one another. And number three, a third thing that we did is what we call handover emails. Now, this is really to establish the essence of follow the sun working methods, right? So we didn't want any surprises anymore in GitHub or in Bitbucket and teams coming in the morning and not really knowing what happened on the other side of the world while they were sleeping. So site A would send site B this exact template. This is an exact template, right? So we identified the needed information for what's the version number, which P1 bugs or severity 1 defects are still outstanding, and most importantly, down at the bottom, what they expect the next site waking up to pick up and take forward. Now, when I say handover emails, I do not necessarily mean emails. We used an email. You can use a different repository. You can use Confluence, for example, and other things. As long as you find an effective mechanism to get your different sites to handshake. Now, when Team A came back in the morning, exact same template waited for them in their inbox from site B to site A. Which are the P1s that were dealt with and still outstanding? What's the current version number? What they expect us, or that team, to pick up and take forward, okay? So again, it doesn't really matter if it's an email, if it's something else. And by the way, it doesn't really have to be at the end of each day throughout the sprint. Throughout time, we realized that the 3 last days of the sprint, for example, before we release out a version, the March after the P1 bugs is starting to be very intense, that's where we want to do that. But then we were very disciplined about sending those, okay, so that we eliminate surprises and we eliminate duplication of work and other things like that. So remember Lou Gerstner, as long as you find an effective mechanism to handshake effectively between your different sites. So let's wrap this one up. What are the key takeaways that we took away? Remember from that workshop, okay, we wanted to tackle this. What are the key takeaways we took away? We went ahead and we've applied them. And number 1, mutual code reviews. Every time a developer checks in code, any other developer working on their same community, working in the same component, could pick up that code and review it. But we've encouraged our developers from different sites to do that so that they can start interacting, right? Number 2, invest in your COPs, in your community of practices. And I say invest and not manage, because these are really self-run communities where you pick up your champions at the beginning and then you encourage your teams, you give them time, you encourage them to go ahead and run those. And finally, hand over emails and find your mechanism how you want to effectively handshake between your sites, get follow the sun work going over at those critical times. Okay, so we move to backlog management. Remember, I told you there are like smarter way of managing backlog. And I'm getting to this. Now, I apologize up front to all those POs and PMs out there and out there at home. I'm going to simplify your role for just 1 second, just for the sake of our context, which is to make sure your team has a backlog, make sure it's prioritized, right? But when a PO has responsibility over a feature, and that feature is being built by several teams, and those several teams are not co-located, there's other things to factor in when setting priorities, rather than just the ranking. I want to tell you what I'm talking about with a question. So the lights are really strong, but how many of you are local? How many of you are from Lithuania in the crowd here? Huh? I see some hands. Okay, quite a bit. Outside at home in the camera, maybe a few of you. So I have a question for you. How's the baseball league in Lithuania going on these days? How's the baseball league? I mean, is it energetic? How's the team going? First league, second league? Yeah, not sure we have one. Okay. So look, I'm going to assume your baseball league is going quite similar to the baseball league back where I come from Israel, which is we do not have a baseball league. And that's exactly my point. So let's say there's a feature, and I'm giving you a real-life feature from my world, right, entertainment world, to innovate new ways of how Americans watch baseball. Now, let's say that feature is very high up ranked right now because there's the baseball league going to start very soon, right, on CNBC or wherever. And let's say that exactly the same time you have some offshore teams that are available, ready to take on a feature. But it does not make any sense to assign such features to them if they cannot add any value to those features. And it doesn't really matter how high up in the pile that feature is ranked or your other offshore teams are available. Okay, you have to have that sense of adding value for the teams. And I want to give you another example related to broadcasting rights. Now, what's broadcasting rights? Broadcasting rights means there's blackouts, and a certain area of the country, for example, can watch a certain content, and another area cannot. Sometimes it's nation-based. Sometimes it's derived by cities, different cities around the nation or whatever. Some cities can watch a certain content or a game or whatever else, and some cannot. Now, the end-to-end testing of such features is very location-based. You have to be physically in that area to test your feature of broadcasting rights and blackouts, let alone support that later in production. But if you have teams abroad, in Europe, in the Middle East, where I come from, And those teams cannot take end-to-end responsibility of the feature that they're building, right? All the way from design to development to testing to production support. Then better off not to assign such features to them. And again, it doesn't really matter how high up in the ranking ladder those features exist, are prioritized. So when product managers and product owners work with teams and they know that their teams are distributed all around the world, there's other things to factor in rather than just priority. So it's not just about ranking, it's allowing your teams to have end-to-end ownership, it's called, for their features, and in particularly testing and supporting those in production, right? You come in the morning, you have production support issues, the team that built it is the team that fixes it. But you have to allow that as a PO all the way from the start. And the second thing is value add. You got to think which of the teams will add value to certain features before assigning them, for assigning the features to them, not just because you want a good feature at the end, but also you want your team to be proud of what they've developed. That gives them the sense of ownership. Finally, we reach communication. Now, don't get me wrong. I know that the website right now, or the web in general, is full of communication articles and talks, especially in the last year or two, when the world's gone virtual. I'm still gonna share my 3 cents with you, some concrete things that really worked for us. Really easy to apply, gave lots of value. So ROI was very high. But before I do that, if you want to take just one thing, just one sentence out of everything that I'm going to say about communication, it's the next sentence. So listen up. The more humanized the tools you use, the better communication you will have. Right? So if we're having this talk right now, face to face, and you can physically see and feel me and talk to me in the corridors, we're going to have some great communication. And if not, put up the camera, like the nice folks are watching us from all around the world right now, and do that in video. Now, if not, pick up the phone, etc., etc. You got the point, right? And next time you want to communicate with one of your colleagues, before you press that send button on that email, think another second. Maybe you could pick up the phone. And if you're gonna pick up the phone, think maybe you can open up that little camera you have on that laptop. Everybody has that right now. And before doing that, maybe you can invite somebody to coffee and so on and so forth. Okay? Now, I know you get all that, guys. Because you're here, right? You like to socialize, you like to communicate, but it's not just about us. Because as Agile leaders in our organizations, we do not necessarily need to create communication. We need to create the conditions for communication to occur. So it's contagious, right? So if you'll act like that, if you'll operate like that, people will follow. But still, I promised some 3 cents for you, and 3 cents that worked really well for me. What you just saw, this pyrotechnic, I moved it too fast, but it was the rush hour, I call it, okay? It's from 4 p.m. to 7 p.m. European time, for example. So let's say you want to talk to people from the US or people from the US and India all at the same time. I'm sure many have that all the time, especially in large organizations, in global corporates, right? But what happened, at least for us, forget Zoom. Sometimes you want to sit in a nice boardroom and with the other side as well and have some better communication. But there was a queue, literally a queue, to the 2 only telepresence and conferencing systems rooms that we had in our site. So our management acknowledged that and invested money and purchased and equipped 15 other meeting rooms with high-end telepresence and video conferencing systems, just to allow and encourage all the employees to jump on ad hoc face-to-face meetings whenever they needed to. Another quick win, the BFFs. Now, if you would watch the Paris Hilton show, as I did, you would know what I'm talking about. And BFF stands for Best Friends Forever. Now, as much as it may sound simple, it gives a lot of value. Look, we took this very seriously. I had my BFFs, a few program managers. The POs had their BFFs. The architects and the developers had the BFFs. And I made sure that I had their phone number, personal phone number on my speed dial, and I made sure that we were both feeling very comfortable calling or texting each other in the middle of the night or at Saturdays and the weekends whenever we needed to. Now, do you remember that lack of physical water cooler that we had in the program because we were remote? This kind of bypasses that lack of physical water cooler for you, and it creates a whole new layer of informal communication between your employees. I would truly encourage that, and I would truly encourage you, if you haven't already done that, in exactly 5 minutes from now when you step out the door, identify your 1 or 2 BFFs, start texting them, start making them feel, I mean, if they're abroad, if they're in different site, right? Folks from India, folks from the US, folks from other parts of Europe. And socialize, right? And again, I know you guys are socialized people, that's why you're here, but contage the ones around you. Now, this is me in Chicago in one of my business trips, and you know, I never let my pencil drop at 5 p.m. and run to the hotel. And I'm sitting, you know, between Tushar and Pete, having a good laugh and drink with them, and just in front of me are Sarah and Dave. And it's not just for the good times in that evening, but it's so that we will have a smoother and seamless working atmosphere the next morning in the office, even when I come back home and they stay in Chicago. All right? So socialize, and remember, technology will move forward, the world will go virtual more than ever before. This paradigm is not going to go over, even when the pandemic will go over. But humans, they remain humans. And so humanize the tools that you use, humanize your ceremonies, and socialize as much as you can. Key learnings, but these learnings are not just enough for you. These key learnings need to be cascaded down to your peers, to those around you. It's not very easy to teach stuff like this. It comes, you know, from acting. Number 1, create a BFF list. Number 2, humanize the tools that you use as much as possible, all the time. Open your cameras. I know how difficult it is. And number 3, socialize as much as you can. By the way, you can socialize virtually, right? Remember your colleagues' birthdays or whatever. Now, I want to pause here, and I want to take everything I've just discussed and walk through. And I want to share with you, and with this I'm going to wrap up, but I want to share with you, what have we learned along this journey of ours, right? What have we achieved? What have we accomplished about 1 year into this journey with this huge program? What could you achieve in your organization if you take some quick wins and apply? Well, number 1, we've been able to generate a 24/6 delivery machine, literally following the sun, not just for production support, for ongoing software development. A second thing is, we've been able to leverage experienced talents abroad and onboard experienced teams seamlessly and work with them very effectively wherever they sit around the world. And number 3, we've been able to generate a one working team atmosphere where all of our ceremonies are unite and everybody feels part of a community, and folks feel proud to work on this program, knowing each other, socializing with each other. But then most importantly, and our biggest turnaround was, our journey to follow the sun was safe again. I want to thank you so very much for being here and listening to me. Thank you so very much. Thank you folks out there around the world, virtually. Thank you so very much.
Thank you, Amir. Thank you, everyone listening. Great presentation. And I'm following Pine, so if you have any questions, I'm looking at you, online audience. You can write it down at Pine. If we have any questions here, we have. Okay, nobody wants to write at Pine, right? But let's do it next time. Now I'll hear it out loud, but next time we do it on Pine. So, okay.
Sure. Apologies for not...
No, it's okay.
So, my name is Ant, and I'm from Germany. So, My question would be, in this large organization setup that you have, and especially the global organization setup, do you have certain practices around important meetings, meaning meetings that may be globally relevant rather than one location relevant?
Okay, I'll just make the question out loud so everyone understands. So do you have any practices about important meetings, right?
Globally important meetings that are relevant not only to one location but for
About globally important meetings that are important not only for all the teams.
Yeah, Anton, thanks very much for this question. Very practical question, so I'm happy you raised it. I truly am. I'll give you one thing. Make them reoccurring if you can. For example, sprint planning or demos. So if we wait for the end of the sprint, end of each sprint, or the beginning of each sprint, if it's sprint planning or PI planning, and only then we try to figure out time zones and people calendars, we'll never get that meeting done. Or if we will, 50% of the people will not show up. However, if we set those meetings to be reoccurring, and if I know that a certain feature team or a certain Agile release train, what's their planning in March of 2022 and May of 2022, I know that already in my calendar, I have that already in my calendar, then more likely it will occur, and it will occur with all the attendees on the same day, same time. I'll even be more practical in my answer. So I'm from Israel. We worked with folks in Europe and then in the US, East Coast and West Coast. We have decided, after lots of trial and error, that Wednesdays, 5 p.m. Israel time, that's also Vilnius time, is the best day and time to conduct demos. And that's what we did. That was reoccurring for like a year and a half going forward. So that's one thing. A second thing is, and that's something I talked about, is sit in video conferencing rooms. Now, 5 years ago, 4 years ago, with this case study, Zoom wasn't that popular. But even today, when Zoom is popular, we still try to be disciplined about, if we are in the office, or those who are in the office, get into the same room, just open a video and just sit in the same room. I mean, it gives a nicer effect of people sitting together rather than everybody just in their little box. So I would say those two things could give value on that.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you for your question. And we have one more question, so let's make it quick.
I have a question about the code reviews. You mentioned that you have a code review in team and by some remote team is doing code review. My question is more about how do you manage this cognitive load and the knowledge in such a scaled organization that some remote team can effectively code review another team, which scope is not familiar for them.
Right. Right.
I'm not sure I can retell the question in a right manner.
I can.
Okay, that's right. Okay.
Yeah. So I'll try to see if I understood. So somebody writes a code, checks in the code. Let's say it's a user story, and somebody else needs to review it. But that somebody else is sitting somewhere else around the world, wasn't really involved in all the beginning. How can they code review effectively and understand? Right? Yeah. So, I mean, you're spot on. Okay, you're spot on. That's a challenge. No, seriously. But think about the value here. So, if something goes bad in production, and let's say it's a Friday, right? So in Israel, we do not work on Fridays. That's our weekend. But abroad, somebody does work on Friday. Or let's say there's Thanksgiving, right? And Americans don't work on Thanksgiving, but Europeans do, right? Our teams in London do. What I've just described about having code reviews between teams in other sites or between developers in other sites gives a lot of value in that extent. So if push comes to shove and something really bad happens in production, then other people can at least give the first triage, at least give the first insight into tackling that issue. But you're right that it's not really easy for code reviews. That's why that was like a second level of code review if it's different people from different sites. When there's peer review, peers sitting alongside each other, that's a good and effective code review. When we had 2 different developers from different sites. That was the second code review. It was just on the level more of syntax checking, for example, and for sharing knowledge so that really if push comes to shove in production, they at least have the global, the bigger picture of what's going on with the feature, can give a first triage, first production, first level support if something happens. It will.
Thank you. Great question. And we have one more. Let's make this the last one since you have to switch stages if you want. After Giedrius, thank you for using Pine. And I know now that it's working all good. So Giedrius is asking, how do you avoid elitism? Some teams doing shiny things and others scraping tech debt. How do you deal with specialization in complex projects? So Amir, no easy questions here.
No, it's... Okay, so these are folks working in the trenches. Okay, so these are stuff that we deal with. It's not an easy question, but more than it's not an easy question, it's not an easy situation to deal with. It's like tech debt, teams that you just give them the junk, right? The production support bugs, and all the rest of the teams do these fun, cool features. Remember the smarter backlog management. It starts there, right? It starts there. It starts with the product owner of the team being kind of sensitive to all of that, being sensitive to the things I've talked about, the 2 examples I've talked about, for the teams to have added value for the features, for the teams to have end-to-end ownership, but it continues to other examples. This is a great one. Not to let an entire team... Now, sometimes it can happen for a sprint. One team needs to take care of their P1 bugs because their area of their code is really doing harmful things in production. Okay, that can happen for a sprint. But you're right, teams' morale can go very low when you assign them for a few sprints in a row, only junk work, right, tech debts. So it starts from the PO to be sensitive to that and to assign some new stuff, new features, cool features to all of the teams. All of the teams get represented. Remember that principle. All the teams get represented. Nobody gets left out, even in this mindset stuff.
Yes, so thank you, Giedrius and others, for really smart questions. Thank you, everyone watching. And a big thanks to Amir. A round of applause once again. Thank you, Amir.
Thank you.